There is an object that exists almost in its entirety as a legend. It has appeared in museums across Europe, described in school textbooks, referenced in courtroom arguments, and depicted in hundreds of years of visual art. It has a name that almost everyone recognizes, and the overwhelming weight of historical scholarship now agrees that, in its most famous form, it almost certainly never existed: the Iron Maiden. And yet the story of why it was invented, who invented it, what it was designed to do, and why it was considered so extreme that even contemporaries recoiled from it, that story is real. And it reveals something more disturbing than the object itself. The question this episode asks is not, did the Iron Maiden exist? The question is, why did people need it to? The popular image of the Iron Maiden is precise and consistent. A hollow iron cabinet, shaped roughly like a human figure. The interior lined with iron spikes. A condemned prisoner placed inside. The doors closed. The spikes, calibrated by legend, to avoid vital organs and prolong death, doing their work slowly over hours or days. This is the version that appears in 19th century travel accounts, in the collections of curiosity cabinets, and in the display cases of European museums from Vienna to Edinburgh. It looks medieval. It reads as medieval for about 2 centuries, and it was treated as medieval. The problem is the evidence. When historians began examining the actual surviving Iron Maiden specimens in the 19th and 20th centuries, the same objects that had been displayed to paying audiences as instruments of medieval justice, they found something unexpected. The objects were assemblages, pieces from different periods, different countries, and different functions, combined into a single striking display object, most likely in the late 18th or early 19th century. The Nuremberg Iron Maiden, perhaps the most famous specimen, was examined in detail by historian Peter Sperenberg and others, and found to be a confection of disparate metal components given a coherent, horrifying form for a museum audience. It was a fabrication, not a forgery in the criminal sense, but a deliberate construction of a compelling artifact to meet a demand that already existed. The demand was the real story. To understand why the Iron Maiden was invented as a concept, you have to understand what European audiences in the 18th and 19th centuries wanted from medieval history. The Enlightenment had established a powerful intellectual narrative that the modern era represented progress over a barbarous past. Torture, arbitrary punishment, and judicial cruelty were being abolished, or at least reforming, across Europe in the decades around 1800. What Enlightenment writers needed, and what their readers wanted, was a vivid emblem of the past they were leaving behind. The Iron Maiden served this function perfectly. It was visually legible. You could understand its horror at a glance, without explanation. It was anonymous, attributed to the medieval period, without a specific date, court, or location that might invite scrutiny. And it was spectacular in a way that abstract institutional cruelty, the slow grind of imprisonment, was the bureaucratic process of judicial torture could never quite achieve in a display case. Scholars have traced the first clear written descriptions of the Iron Maiden to the late 18th century, and the first surviving objects to roughly the same period. There are no reliable medieval trial records that reference it, no legal codes that authorize it, no inquisitorial manuals that describe it. The silences in the historical record are as significant as the absences. What this means is that the Iron Maiden, in its famous spiked cabinet form, it is largely a product of the era that claimed to be abolishing torture, not the era it accused of inventing it. What actually was considered too cruel. The real devices, 415 to 530. But this raises the genuine question the episode has been building toward. If the Iron Maiden is largely mythological, What was the device that was actually considered too cruel? And by whom? And by what standard? The historical answer is more complicated and more instructive. There were real instruments of torture and execution in medieval and early modern Europe that were abandoned, restricted, or condemned not because they failed to cause suffering, but because they caused the wrong kind of suffering, in the wrong way, for the wrong institutional reasons. One such instrument, real, documented, and genuinely controversial, was the Judas Cradle, and its story takes us into the actual logic of medieval pain. The Judas Cradle, called in German the Judaswiege, in Italian the Culla di Giuda, was a pyramidal wooden or metal seat, pointed at the apex. The prisoner was suspended above it by ropes and pulleys and lowered, slowly, under mechanical control, onto the point. The device did not kill quickly. It was not designed to. Unlike many instruments of judicial torture, so the Judas Cradle had a specific procedural function. It was intended to extract confessions over time without permanently disabling the prisoner before a trial concluded. The session could be paused. The prisoner could be raised. Interrogation could resume. References to it appear in early modern European legal and inquisitorial records, primarily from the 16th and 17th centuries, though the precise dating and provenance of specific accounts is contested among historians. The device appears in at least some contemporary torture manuals and court procedure documents, suggesting it was known and used in certain judicial contexts. But here is what made it distinctive, and what made it controversial, even within systems that otherwise accepted judicial torture as legal and legitimate. It was considered unreliable, degrading in a way that undermined the dignity of the judicial process, and difficult to control. To understand why any torture device could be considered too cruel, you have to understand what judicial torture was actually for, because the popular answer and the institutional answer are very different. In the medieval and early modern legal tradition, Roman law, canon law, and the law of the German territories, torture was not primarily a punishment. It was a tool of evidence gathering. Confession was the most powerful form of evidence available in courts that lacked forensic science, witness protection, or police investigative capacity. The legal term was confessio regina probationum, confession, the queen of proofs. Torture was not, legally, supposed to be about suffering. It was supposed to be about truth. The law placed significant procedural restrictions around it. Torture could only be applied when there was already substantial evidence against the accused, sufficient circumstantial proof that guilt was likely. It was supposed to be administered in graduated steps, with the prisoner warned of what was coming. Medical supervision was required in some jurisdictions, and crucially, a confession extracted under torture was supposed to be voluntarily repeated, without torture, the following day. If the prisoner recanted, and the confession was legally invalidated. This procedural framework was not followed consistently in practice. Powerful interests could override it. Inquisitors had wide latitude. But the framework existed, and it reveals something important. Judicial torture was embedded in a bureaucratic and legal logic that tried, however imperfectly, to distinguish between legitimate controlled pain and illegitimate uncontrolled cruelty. Devices that were considered too cruel were not necessarily those that caused the most suffering. They were those that disrupted this logic, that made control impossible, made confession unreliable, or made the institution using them look more like a mob than a court. The Judas Cradle violated several of these institutional criteria simultaneously. First, it was uncontrollable in its effects. The degree of suffering it produced was not easily calibrated. The weight of the prisoner, the angle of descent, minor variations in positioning, all of these made consistent, gradual application impossible. Courts preferred instruments like the strappado, the rope and pulley dislocating device, precisely because they could be administered in documented, measurable steps. The Judas cradle offered no such precision. Second, the confessions it produced were contaminated. A prisoner in extreme prolonged pain will say anything to end the session. Courts knew this. Legal theorists knew this. The problem was not squeamishness. It was epistemic. If a prisoner confessed to anything under the cradle, how could a court determine what was true? The device made the queen of proofs worthless. Third, it was degrading in a specific way that violated the dignity requirements of the judicial process. Medieval and early modern courts were highly sensitive to the performative dimension of justice. Executions were theatrical, so were trials. The appearance of rational, controlled, a dignified procedure was institutionally important. The Judas cradle produced a spectacle of humiliation that sat uneasily with the self-image of courts that considered themselves servants of law and God. And fourth, it left marks that couldn't be explained. Jurisprudence in many jurisdictions prohibited torture that permanently maimed the accused before conviction. Torture was supposed to extract truth, and not pre-punish. Devices that produced injuries the court couldn't deny created legal and political problems. The tension between what torture was supposed to do and what it actually did was not merely theoretical. It appeared in institutional friction across jurisdictions. In the Holy Roman Empire, the Carolina, the criminal law code of 1532, commissioned by Charles V, attempted to codify and restrict judicial torture across the German territories. The Carolina specified precisely when torture could be applied, what evidence was required to justify it, and how it was to be administered. It was, for its time, a remarkable attempt to embed controlled violence in a rational legal framework. The Carolina did not abolish torture, but by setting explicit rules, it created a legal standard against which specific devices and practices could be measured and found wanting. The logic of too cruel was now institutional, not merely moral. A device was too cruel when it violated the Carolina's framework, when it was disproportionate, when it made confession unreliable, when it removed the prisoner's ability to function as a legal subject who could meaningfully confess, recant, or testify. The phrase "too cruel" in the context of medieval and early modern justice was almost never a moral absolute. It was a functional judgment. When a court, an inquisitor, or a legal theorist condemned a device as excessive, they were rarely saying, "This causes too much suffering." They were saying something more precise. This device disrupts the process we depend on. It makes evidence unreliable. It exposes the institution to criticism. It produces outcomes we cannot control or justify. The history of torture in early modern Europe is, in significant part, a history of institutional attempts to contain and channel violence into legible, controllable, defensible forms. The devices that fell outside this framework, the ones condemned as too cruel, were condemned not because they crossed a clear moral line, but because they made the line itself visible in an uncomfortable way. The Iron Maiden, the mythological version, was too cruel in a different sense. It was too cruel to be real, which is precisely why it became so useful as a symbol. It could bear the entire weight of a civilization's self-condemnation without requiring anyone to examine the actual, documented, a legal machinery of controlled suffering that had operated for centuries and in some cases continued to operate in their own institutions. The Iron Maiden myth, understood correctly, is historical evidence. just not evidence of what it claims to be. The myth tells us what early 19th century European audiences needed to believe about the past. They needed the past to be monstrous in a specific, concrete, visually legible way. They needed a device so obviously excessive that no reasonable institution could have authorized it, because that let them off the hook for the institutions they actually had, which were more subtle and more durable. When you examine the Nuremberg Iron Maiden in the context of the museum that commissioned it, the travel writers who described it, and the abolitionists who cited it, you find that it was constructed as a moral prop for a progressive narrative. The medieval barbarian needed a prop. The Iron Maiden was that prop. Historians call this phenomenon presentism, the projection of current moral anxieties onto the past. But the Iron Maiden case is a particularly elegant example, and because the projection was literal, they actually built the object they needed. The abolition of judicial torture in Europe during the 18th century is one of the most celebrated achievements of Enlightenment legal reform. By 1800, torture had been formally abolished in Prussia, Austria, France, and most of the German states. Britain, which had always maintained a more restricted relationship with judicial torture, had completed its abolition earlier. What replaced it? Imprisonment? Solitary confinement? Labor camps? Systems of surveillance and behavioral control that Foucault and others have argued were in many respects more total in their reach, if less immediately legible in their violence, than what preceded them. The transition from public torture to institutional imprisonment was not simply a story of progress, it was a story of displacement. The violence moved from the body in the square to the mind in the cell. The institutions changed. The underlying problem, how do you make people confess, comply, and conform, remained. The Iron Maiden, with its dramatic spikes and immediate horror, was a useful distraction from this more complex story. A story in which the reforms were real, and the costs were real. The end neither fit cleanly into a narrative of simple moral progress. Every society that uses institutionalized violence draws a line somewhere. The line is never simply moral. It is procedural, political, epistemic, and performative all at once. Medieval and early modern courts drew their lines with considerable sophistication and considerable self-interest. The devices they condemned as too cruel were, more often than not, the ones that made the system look like what it was. A machine for producing compelled compliance, dressed in the language of law and truth. The Iron Maiden, which probably never existed in its famous form, he has occupied more historical memory than the Strappado, or the Carolina, or the actual documented apparatus of early modern judicial pain. Precisely because it is easier to condemn something spectacular and fictional than something ordinary and real. What the history of these devices actually teaches is quieter and harder to exhibit in a museum case. It is this: the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate violence is not fixed by nature. It is drawn by institutions for institutional reasons, and it moves when institutions need it to. That is not a medieval lesson. It is not an early modern lesson. It is the lesson that the Iron Maiden, real or not, has always been trying to distract us from.